Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome.
I am Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, my guest is Kilian Valkhof, the founder and CEO of Polypane. Polypane is a browser built by developers for developers to help making websites truly the best that they can be. It does this by showing you your website with literally polypanes or many panes to show you what they look like as mobile sites, as responsive tablet-size sites, as full-size websites, etc. And you can see all of them in parallel, and they are linked such that when you scroll on one, you scroll on all. When you click on one, you click on all. And this way, you can model and visualize your website in a different variety of contexts and make sure it works perfectly. Polypane also offers suggestions and hints for making sure your meta tags are proper, your accessibility is accounted for, and more. Polypane truly takes websites from good to great to excellent. Kilian also, after recording this episode, helped me make my website better with Polypane by helping me fix my open graph image. That's the social preview image you get when sharing links to websites. And so I want to thank Kilian for that. Polypane has already proven value for me, and I hope through the discussion you understand how it works internally. We talk about some of the challenges that Kilian had to navigate in building such a browser, and we talk about upcoming features that they're building and how they're built, such that you can actually use Polypane across devices. So it's not just on one machine, but you can browse using Polypane on your mobile device, and when you scroll on your literal iPhone, your computer updates, so you can actually link and test behavior across devices. It's so cool, and we dive into the technical details of all of that. This is truly a treasure trove of advice for how you can make your websites and apps better, but also an internal deep dive into Polypane and how it's built, including the business side. Towards the end, we wrap up with advice for founders, technical founders, and how to actually run a business from software. This is super valuable information, and I can't wait for you to dive in. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of you at zero cost, and this is very much separate to my day job. The way I can do that is through sponsors and partners. So let's take a moment and thank them. The Contagious Code podcast is brought to us by Code Crafters. Code Crafters is a partner with a teaching style very similar to mine. Like, they use the programming language that you choose, that you know and that you're comfortable with, something like JavaScript or TypeScript or Python, and they help you rebuild tools that we use every day, like Git and Docker, etc., and Redis. And by doing that, we learn how these tools work, but we also get better at the language. It's a really great way to learn, and they have a really generous free tier. But should you start paying, you can get 40%, that's nearly half off, using the link in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. The Contagious Code podcast is also partnered with That Conference. That Conference is a family-style, multidisciplinary tech conference that happens twice a year, once in Wisconsin and once in Texas in the United States. We often send people to this conference for free if they like the podcast. And so if you want to attend for free, share this episode on social media, say you want to win, and you will enter a raffle to do so. Finally, the Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Stately.ai. Stately is a great way to visualize the flow of state through your applications using state machines or state charts. That you can then export these state charts to JSON, where everything's defined, and the only thing you need to fill in is the business logic that triggers a transition between states of your application. Once you do that, you have a working application. It's pretty rad. They also have tools to help you create deterministic workflows with AI agents called Stately Agent. If you'd like to give this a try, go to stately.ai. Hey, thanks for sticking around. And now for my discussion with Kilian Valkhof.
Kilian Valkhof, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you about Polypane, about testing, about compatibility, about all the things. We met briefly at a conference where I think it was a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, and we started talking about all of these topics, and I thought, it would be so great to have you on, founder and CEO season of the podcast. So with that, maybe we can start with just a little bit of an introduction to yourself, to Polypane,
Sure.
what you've been up to recently.
Yeah, so I'm Kilian. I'm a developer from the Netherlands. I've been developing websites for a very long time.
Yeah, I can see that on your Silverlight cup.
Yes, I'll show it for the camera again.
Yeah.
My coffee cup
Yeah,
is
Microsoft
a Microsoft
Silverlight. Wow.
coffee cup. It's the only Silverlight thing in the world that still works. But yeah, so I got started making websites when I was 11. Started making websites professionally when I was 16. That's when I started my first company. With the idea of, I already make websites, why not try and get people to pay for it? and they did.
So this was sort of like a consulting, like websites as a service type company?
I mean, we didn't call it like that back then, but it was just like making websites for small businesses in the area, and then that grew to local governments, to larger businesses, to multinationals, etc.
Awesome.
And then at some point, like 5-6 years ago, I had sort of finished that. Like there was no real challenge for me anymore. And you can only make so many websites before there's nothing new.
Yes.
And at the same time, I've always been like developing tools, GUIs for stuff that annoys me. And one of them was Polypane. And it was just like one of the tools that I built for myself that I like using and didn't really think much about. I did it as a fun project in a technology that I didn't know. But at some point, I was looking at my hours, like pre-Polypane and post-Polypane. And I noticed I was suddenly developing like the same type of websites 60% faster. And that's when when the gear started turning, like, I'm kind of done with building websites for other people. And I have this thing that, it really helps me do things more efficiently. Of course, like starting a company at 16 means I've always wanted to do a product company, have like a quote unquote startup. So I decided that, it was time for a change and went full in on Polypane. I realized I haven't introduced Polypane. Polypane is a web browser for developers. Well, what does that mean? It means that instead of being really good at searching Google and browsing Facebook and looking up stuff in Wikipedia, it's really good at all the tasks that you need to do as a developer. So check for all the responsive screen sizes that works on all devices. Check for, all the media features like dark mode, reduced motion, prefers contrast, forced colors. It makes it really easy to test all those different permutations of your web page, because a web page isn't just like one monolithic thing. It was when I started, but it hasn't been for well over a decade. And then also all the other stuff that you as a developer care about or should care about, like performance, accessibility, like all your meta information, like getting all the details right. And Polypane is a browser that surfaces all of those things and then, tells you like how to improve, where to improve. It also gives you props if you already do it well, because that's part of the process. And I've been working on that full time for the last 5 years. In fact, 5 years ago, on this day, May 14th, I launched Polypane 1.0.
Oh, wow.
So it's a bit of a celebration day as well.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, so you decided making websites was too, you reached the ceiling, so to speak, of what you can do with a website. And of course, this is assuming you didn't go into like these edge areas, I would say, like for example 3D.
Mm-hmm.
Some people do their entire websites in 3D. There's this really great website by this one guy that's his portfolio where there's a car and you can drive it around the webpage. I don't know if you've seen this, but I'm assuming you mean you built so much of the same website that you went like, okay, this is kind of boring. Let's build something more ambitious. And this more ambitious thing was Polypane, the browser for web developers. I'd love to talk a little bit about what goes into that. Because when I was a kid, I also, by the way, built my first website around, 11 or something. When I was a kid, I thought, wow, I could do so much with this technology. I didn't quite understand hardware, firmware, and software as well as I do today. And I thought, well, look, Windows XP is just a big UI, right? So in theory, I could make a web page OS.
Yes.
And I tried this when I was a kid. And it was pretty great, except, it didn't do all the things that an OS does, which is basically coordinating hardware. And so I thought, okay, where can we go from here? Anyway, all that to say, I did try to make an OS. I wonder, the question here is, how does one make a browser? And I have to assume this is made with web technology. So this is made with JavaScript, HTML, CSS.
Yes.
Because like if I ask someone how to make a browser, they'll go like, oh, learn C++ and add it, create an engine, and then create a layout engine and a JavaScript engine and do it in C++ or Rust. I'm curious if we could speak a little bit to the engineering of your browser, and maybe like pull out some ideas for people listening if they want to create their own like specialized browser. Maybe not for developers, maybe for AI, maybe for, I don't know, whatever it may be.
Yeah. So I think the first point there is to differentiate between a browser and a rendering engine. So a while back, I created a post called "How I Built My Own Browser," which also it goes sort of into this, like why do I build my own browser as like a single guy? Because that sounds like a really weird thing to do. If there's like the three biggest companies in the world, they have their own browser and then basically no one else. And so, of course, that got posted on Hacker News, and like all the top comments were, he didn't build a browser, he just made a skin. Like, yeah, I didn't build a rendering engine, which is a completely different beast from a browser. Like a browser uses a rendering engine to display web pages, and then all the stuff around a web page is what you would call a browser. Like Chrome is the browser, but Chromium is the rendering engine. So that's also roughly how it works for Polypane. Like I use Chromium to render my web pages, and I do that with Electron, which is a framework that builds desktop websites with web technologies. So it runs Node.js on the backend to like manage your actual desktop windows and interfacing with the operating system. And then it runs Chromium to render those windows. So that means I get, the layout engine or the rendering engine for free. And then all I have to do, like quote unquote, all is build up the entire UI, right? So the UI in Polypane is built in React. It runs React 18, but it started all the way back with React 0.13.
Wow.
So it's gone, there's layers to the code. Because I'm not refactoring everything that I've built all the time.
Yeah.
I mean I have more important things to do. But I think it's important to keep up with all of these things. So I use React for all the UI, for all the the address bar and the navigation buttons and opening panels, closing panels, etc. And then hand off as much as possible to the rendering engine and to the Node.js website or Node.js site to keep things performant.
Wow. Okay. So I love that distinction, by the way, of rendering engine, even JavaScript engine and browser. Because if we think about just the semantics of it, browser means something that browses. It just navigates. And I love that you draw that parallel there. Okay. So it's a UI that uses Electron or Chromium as the rendering engine. I'm curious, since it's a browser for developers, and what's really important to web developers is cross-compatibility across browsers. For example, Safari is often late to the party, right? And I want my thing to be compatible with Safari. Right. Or maybe Firefox, whatever. We can pick on one of the non-majority browsers. If Polypane renders exclusively in Chromium, how can I get that using this product as a web developer?
Yeah, so it really comes down to two parts. So Polypane is always going to use the Chromium rendering engine. I would love to have like a Polypane that includes Gecko and that includes WebKit. And maybe someday I will, but for now, that's just not realistic, if only because WebKit as it's bundled in Safari is a completely different beast from like the WebKit that renders in something called like Epiphany on Linux. Like if you compare those two, you wouldn't say that they're the same rendering engine. So that's just not something you can depend on. However, Chromium is really good at emulation. So Polypane can make your website think that it runs in iOS, that it runs on an Android phone.
Wow.
With like all the details, like the user agent, of course, but the platform, the pixel density, the viewport size compared to the device size, all these things that can subtly influence how a page renders. Polypane can emulate those. And that means that your website thinks it's running on that device. And that in turn means that all the things you do to compensate for specific workings of Safari, of Chromium on Android, you can test those in Polypane. So all the stuff you do to cater to Safari, to cater to Android, you can do in Polypane with emulation. A pertinent example of that is if you're developing Ionic apps, they will automatically switch out the icons for iOS and Android so that you get like the native looking icons. Doing that in Polypane is as easy as picking an iPhone and an Android phone side by side, and the icons will flip. So that's one part of the equation. Of course, if you have a rendering issue in Safari or a missing API in Firefox, that's not something you can test in Polypane because, it doesn't have that same rendering bug because it's specific to Safari.
Yeah.
For a long time, my advice to people was, Polypane is really useful, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to test all the browsers because, that's part of your job. Test all the browsers. It's not the most fun part of your job, but every job has to have stuff that isn't fun, I think. However, like beginning of this year, I came out of like the Christmas holiday and I had this idea, and that it's been on my backlog for a long, long time, but I just started like hacking on it. Like I built a spike to see like, can I make this work? And the thing I built is a proxy that's inside Polypane that proxies your local server. So if you're in Polypane and you're working on like a local Next project or any local website, a local MEMP, whatever, you can proxy that through Polypane, either to the network or to a public URL, like a for sale preview.
Wow.
And Polypane then injects a script that keeps track of all the actions you do in Polypane, and then it mirrors those actions in all browsers that have that proxied URL open. So you can have your local host shown in Polypane, and then make a proxy with like a single button click. It pops up a QR code. You scan that with your phone. It opens the web page on your phone. And if you scroll or click or type or do anything inside Polypane, it also happens on your phone.
So you can I sorry to interrupt you here, but
Yeah?
I think we maybe missed one important detail about Polypane, which is it's a single driver. So you have many panes. I mean, I assume that's where the name comes from. You have many panes, and you drive one pane, and all the other panes, all the other windows, so to speak, into your website update. So you control in a central place, and then everything follows you basically. And
Exactly.
so what I'm hearing here is it's cross-device now, which is so cool. I could open my website on my iPad on like 50 other devices, and I drive in one place and I watch my UI across even devices. Now, is that
Exactly?
correct?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So the whole concept of Polypane is that you see a single page, because that's how browsers work. You see a single page. but you see that single page in all the permutations that you care about. And then
when you control one permutation, you control all permutations.
Yeah, because you're interacting with a single page, right? It just happens to be shown at different sizes. And, if you get into the technical implementation of that, it's kind of different. But, that's the goal. That's the interaction you have with your page. And so by pulling that out of Polypane and onto devices, or, not just like devices you own, but you could also, instead of you working on a feature, you having to come up with a commit message, or, AI coming up with a commit message and pushing that to a branch, and then slacking your teammate and then saying, check out this branch, and then they have to pull it, and they have to install the dependencies and then get it running, and then they see the web page. You can just open a proxy, send them the link, and see, hey, look at this. And by the way, if I click here, here, and here, this is what happens. And they can see that live. And you can do that with your teammate or a customer. So it's really powerful. And it ended up being not even super complex to build. I was kind of surprised by that. But, WebSockets are really easy to work with on this scale. I'll add that. So that's the solution that I have for like cross-browser, cross-platform testing.
Yeah, because if it works on a different device, it will also work in Safari. You can open this proxy in Safari just next to your Polypane.
Yeah.
And okay, wow, that is so cool. What a great answer. I was not expecting something this impressive. Now I'm very interested in the engineering implementation details of all of this. And I would love to talk about that. I mean, this whole podcast is about deep dives and celebrating the beauty of engineering, among other things. So, okay, let's talk about this. If I was to implement this from scratch, and I don't know how, I'll put it, I have been building on the web for over 20 years, but every time we're approached with a novel problem, we have to, pull on a few different threads and see, okay, where do I start? What fits, right? And my approach now is actually I just go to some type of AI tool and go like, how would you start? And get some inspiration from there. So my initial idea, if you're my boss, you give me this problem to solve, I'm initially going to go, okay, I'm aware of ngrok. This, and for those listening who don't know, ngrok is a command line tool that opens a secure tunnel to your machine. So your local host gets a domain over HTTPS, and you can send that link to some folks, and they can. It's like a deploy preview, except you don't push anything. So
exactly.
I would go look at ngrok. I know it's open source, so I'd go look at the implementation. How are they doing it? What are they doing? They're probably tapping into the network layer of the OS somehow. So that's where I would start. So the question: does this feature, this proxy feature, leverage mechanisms from ngrok, or even ngrok itself as an open source tool, or no. Am I wrong here? Okay,
no. So there's a few few implementations of this. Like there's ngrok, there's Cloudflare tunnels, there's a bunch of other tools. The one I started with is called Local Tunnel, and I started with that one because it's built in Node. So that means that I can integrate it in all the other existing tooling that I have. It does like not 1, but like 10% of the things ngrok does.
Yeah.
But it's the 10% that I need. So that works for me. ngrok has a bunch of more specific features that are very useful if you need them. But for this use case, they weren't really needed. So that's where I started. And then if you get down to it, you're essentially creating like 2 web servers locally on your device. And then if you have a public URL, then there's a 3rd web server making that available through a public URL. But like you have one web server running on your device that just listens to traffic. So that's on a unique port, different from your
dev server.
Your dev server. Then, depending on the type of traffic that it gets, it sends that to a proxy server, and that proxy server forwards it to your dev server. And that proxy server is like responsible for making sure that like the headers get transformed, that it deals well with like any SSL certificate that you're running. If you have a local server, maybe you're not running an SSL certificate, or you're running a self-signed one, and all of those, or both of those, can be very iffy when it comes to browsers. So there's some logic there to sort of map the things to the right place. And then, of course, it goes the other way as well, where your dev server responds with some HTML or CSS or whatever that gets forwarded to the proxy. The proxy checks like what type of content am I dealing with. The proxy is the thing that also injects the code for the WebSocket. And that's actually the way that works. This is not something that like I came up with. So I'm not taking credit for anything, but the way this works is pretty interesting because your headers send along how long your content is. So if you have an HTML page, it sends the HTML as a body, and then the headers send along like how
content length.
The content length. So if you then inject something in the body, like a script tag, then the content length is no longer valid. And then your browser throws a fit. So you also need to like recalculate the length of the body with the injected HTML and then overwrite the headers and then send that along, and the other way around. And that's just like one of those things where like I understand why, but it also feels like very archaic. Like I'm sending the thing, and then I also need to send how long the thing is. Like that's weird. But that's the way it is, and you have to work around that and make sure that the browser on the other hand on the other end gets your data and then realize or then knows like, okay, this is what I have to do.
How does this is I understand all of this based on a single like on-device localhost server or a dev server. You mentioned you start a second server that that receives traffic, and then a proxy server. So there's 3 servers. Are all of those on device? Is the proxy server hosted somewhere? I'm asking because you mentioned I could get like an HTTP link and send it to my mother and then control her experience. This implies that there's a hosted server somewhere.
Yes.
Can we speak to that, like the
Sure.
DevOps side? Where does that live?
So
is that just an EC2 instance on AWS? How does that work?
Yeah, so that's just like the third web server is in the cloud. And that's the most simple one because it just forwards to your device, and it doesn't have to do anything except expose that on like an auto-generated subdomain. And then there's some complexity there because you need to make SSL certificates for wildcard domains because I create these subdomain URLs that have like the human readable ID thing, so they're always like magnanimous zebra, yada yada yada. But that's really it just like gets the request and then sends it to your device. And then there's the web server on your device that takes care of sending the right things to the proxy, but then if it gets a request for that WebSocket JavaScript, it serves it directly. And then the proxy sits in between that server and your dev server.
And the proxy speaks WebSockets?
No, the web server on your device speaks WebSockets.
Okay,
and then
to
the
proxy.
No, the proxy doesn't know anything about the WebSocket, because the proxy just sits between the dev server, like your dev server,
Yeah.
and then exposing that to like either your local network or through a public URL. So that proxy
Got it.
doesn't need to know anything about WebSockets because your dev server doesn't need to know anything about those WebSockets. So that WebSocket is essentially routed through your web page into Polypane, and then Polypane sends events to clicks, scrolls, etc.
This is so cool. This sounds like a really great case for event sourcing, because fundamentally that's what you're doing. You're receiving a bunch of events at the browser level, sending those off to the cloud, and then this cloud service is sending them, I'm assuming, over WebSockets to any subscribed. This is literally PubSub 101.
Yeah.
That is so cool. I can think of so many applications here for also education. For example, my mother, if I wanted to teach her like how to use, I don't know, accounting software like Xero or something, and if they have a web-based UI, I'd just be like, here, load this URL, watch me do it. And it's basically like you're showing someone a YouTube video, but it's not a video. It's interactive. Like I'm reminded of these videos of Chef Gordon Ramsay filleting a salmon in front of other chefs, and he's like, okay, look, I'm going to fillet this fish. No, you're going to watch me, and then do it. You can actually do this with this style of using Polypane. I think that's really cool, and I can't wait to see. I wonder if there's applications here for online workshops and things of that nature as well. Because it's one thing to do it over screen share. Right,
Yeah.
It's another thing to actually have it open and changing in real time.
Yeah, so
you could probably also implement something like Visual Studio Live Share or something using such a protocol. But I'm curious if I don't think that's probably within scope for Polypane, but I'm sure you've done some experiments there along those lines.
Yeah, so the way I approach most features is that like I try to get to the 80% of what I think is the useful feature. Because, like, whatever I think the last 20% is never exactly what the last 20% is. And that last 20%, it changes significantly upon contact with users. And so I can now veer into, what most users want. And like one of the things you mentioned is, you can proxy Xero or whatever.
Yeah.
I purposefully don't allow people to proxy any random URL. I check that it's just sites on their local device. And there's multiple ways you can check that. So if you have like a fancy like mywebsite.dev or mywebsite.local, that all works fine, as long as the server originates from your own device. Because I feel very, so I don't think like any random person should be able to proxy apple.com and send it to, whatever. Send it to their friends. That sounds like a really bad idea. But like there are legitimate.
Wait, sorry to interrupt you, but there's probably listeners going, why is that a bad idea? There's people who legitimately will not pick up on why that's a bad idea.
It's a bad idea because people don't read URLs, and even if they like for many people, myself included, I might check the URL once, but I'm not gonna check it like after every click that goes to like visually the same website. So if you then start proxying stuff, people might end up thinking that they're really on the Apple website, and you might be doing nefarious stuff with
their credit cards.
And I don't want that to go through Polypane.
Good.
So that's why. But there are people that develop on a staging server or that are forced to test a staging server, and they now can't use this feature because the staging server isn't your device. It's a server somewhere else. So there are legitimate use cases for that, and I haven't figured out like how to deal with that properly yet. and I'm still like collecting feedback from users, like how do they want to use this, how do they need to use it. Like maybe, for example, CodePen, if you open an iframe directly, like CodePen has three input fields essentially for HTML,
Yes.
CSS, and JavaScript, and then a preview, and a preview is an iframe. If you open that iframe on its own, you get a big fat warning banner that says like, this is not a real website, this is like a CodePen preview, go here if to go to the thing you actually want to go to. Maybe a solution is something like that, where it's just super clear that you're not on apple.com, you're not on whatever.
Yeah.
But that has other implications, because if you inject something visually in the page, then maybe the body is pushed down, but then absolutely positioned elements are now in the wrong position, and then you actually create more issues that then need to be resolved. And I haven't found the answer yet, but this is like the playing field that I'm in.
That's so awesome. Thank you for that deep insight. This reminds me of something that Matthias Bielmann from Netlify, co-founder, CEO, said. He said, he didn't say it the way you said it, but I'm sort of connecting the dots here. He said, there's a time where it's not worth listening to user feedback. Like when your idea is too abstract, people are going to tell you it's a bad idea because it's too novel. They don't get it. What I'm hearing from you is, yes, get it 80% of the way there, until you have something concrete enough for the basis of a discussion, and then just go to users. Okay, what do you think? What would you prefer? And then they actually have enough sort of meat to chew on to give you a valid opinion. I think that's so cool. I think that's a real takeaway for listeners here. Okay, this is really great. I see the application for something like Polypane, because I'm even thinking about it for my own website. I just recently rebuilt my website, and full disclosure, I haven't extensively tested it across a variety of things, and I guess, with Polypane. I will definitely give that a try. I wish something like this existed for the library side, because there isn't such a thing where I can create an NPM package, an NPM library, and then publish it to the NPM. I have to typically publish my library to the NPM registry and then ask my friends to install it. And then I validate, okay, does my library work or not? There's a thing called Verdaccio that sort of gives you a local NPM registry, but there isn't something that does that over HTTP with a proxy. This is maybe a startup idea for somebody wanting to get some inspiration there. Okay, you recently mentioned in Polypane waiting on an Electron bug fix before releasing the next version. It is Electron-based. We've covered that. What is this bug fix? Why does it hinder your releasing the next version? And maybe once we talk about that, we can talk about the new features coming in the next release.
Yeah, sure. So the way Chromium works and the way Electron works is that each bit of like Chromium instance is called a view, and your UI can be built up out of a bunch of these views. Some of these views are windows, some of these views are like, in Chromium, they would be like extension pop-ups, because they're their own little window, or like the permissions pop-up, they're their own little window. All of these are views, and they're like sort of stamped on top of your window.
Would if I open the developer tools, would that be its own view as well then? Do I understand that correctly?
The developer tools are their own view as well. And Electron recently refactored a part of that based on refactorings that Chromium has done. That's a few abstraction layers, but right now the issue is that if you're on Linux, and it doesn't matter which compositor you use, so whether that's X11 or Wayland, for those in the know. But if you have a window and you maximize it, so that it's not full screen, but it maximizes. Then essentially there's some process that goes wrong and your app crashes.
Oh, interesting.
And that happens only on Linux, and it doesn't happen on all Linux devices, and it seems to happen only on like fast Linux devices, which means that everyone testing it in like a VM isn't able to reproduce it.
Just the best kind of bug.
Yeah. But yeah, so if your app crashes, if you maximize it, that's bad. So so I'm kind of stuck because I want to keep track of like the current Chromium version and have Polypane use the current Chromium version because that makes it the most valuable. Like it's not valuable if you use Polypane and it's like 6 months behind of what your actual users who have Chrome, which updates automatically all the time, what they have. Because then you're no longer testing against the thing people use. And the issue doesn't exist on Mac and on Windows. Polypane is available on all three platforms, so I could like conceivably say like I'll release Polypane and it's using the latest Chromium on Mac and Windows, and it's using an older Chromium on Linux. Which I don't want to do because that then splits my code base and it makes debugging less fun. But if it takes very long for that bug to be resolved, like either I'll just release with an older Chromium version, because I don't think I'm willing to split the code base in such a way.
Yeah.
Because there's actually a lot of moving parts to making an Electron app that deploys well on all three platforms. Like they each have their weird little thing that you need to care about. And so that's where I'm at right now.
Right.
People are working really hard on this bug, but it's not solved yet.
What if you would it be an option to release new Polypane for macOS and Windows, but not for Linux until the bug is fixed? Because like this happens all the time. There's an application I just downloaded. I think it's Olama. At this point in time, you can download Olama for macOS and for, I believe, Linux, but not for Windows. It's often like this. You get 2 out of 3 platforms. Yeah. Is that an option? Because I have to assume this would not mean you have to split your code base in any way. You just don't release for one. Yeah.
So I think I could technically do that, but I'm not sure if like I as a person could do that. Like if that's something I'm willing to do. Because there's a significant number of Linux users of Polypane. In part that's because each platform has their own weird little things, and I care about getting those weird little things right. So that means that Polypane runs really, really well on Linux.
Yes.
And if I now go like, I've been serving Linux users like equally as Mac and Windows users, but now after 5 years, you can use the old version, whatever. The new shiny is on Mac and Windows. That it doesn't sit right with me. That's not the type of product that I wanna give out.
Yeah, that's so noble, and I guess this is where the founders sort of, I don't want to use the word feeling because it maybe sounds a little bit too like woo, but the instinct, put it that way, the instinct comes into play, and I respect that. Recently in Polypane, you added a live DOM view and head order visualization based on user feedback, and you mentioned a lot of your users come from Linux. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. What is that? Specifically, head order visualization. I have no idea what that even means. And then we can maybe talk about the value that gives to your developers and users.
Sure. I'll tackle the live DOM view first. Because Polypane shows your web page in multiple different viewports, multiple different screen sizes, I can't actually use the regular Chromium DevTools because each of those viewports is its own view, like we just mentioned. And the Chromium DevTools are built that a DevTools applies to a single view, which makes perfect sense for Chromium, because there's never like a situation where you would have a DevTools that needs to work with multiple views at the same time. But there is in Polypane, because it would be very annoying if you want to like test a change through the DevTools, that you would have to open it one by one and make the same change in all the different viewports just to see that change and see how it works at all screen sizes. So I built my own elements panel. So Polypane has a fully custom built elements panel that does enable that feature, where it shows you the HTML of all the viewports. You can edit all the styles. You can edit all the attributes. There's a class selector. There's additional debug information that Chromium doesn't give you. It's essentially everything I want. I'm building in there, and that's a lot of work. And it's also a lot of processing, because I need to get that DOM. I need to get all the styles. I need to figure out like what is the actual ordering of the styles, like which apply above which other ones. And trust me, browsers don't make that easy. It used to be very simple because you could just have the specificity of a selector, but then browsers added layers, and then browsers added scope, and then browsers added container queries. So I need to do a whole bunch of work to figure out like which styles actually apply, and then out of those styles, which ones are the ones that take preference above the others. Because like you and I can see that, for example, a text is red. But then if there are like 5 styles that each say color red, I need to figure out like which of those 5 is the actual one that's being applied now. So with all of those things that I need to do, one of the conceits that I had was, okay, I'm only updating like the DOM view, like the tree in the elements panel upon interaction. So if you change a style, or if you select an element, or if you edit an attribute somewhere, that's when I get the new DOM and update it in the elements panel. Which I think like is a fair trade-off against like you can literally edit a style and see it happen everywhere. But it's also, a lot of people use that live DOM view as like a monitoring tool, like what is happening in my DOM right now. And
or I guess in the case of Polypane, in my DOMs right now. Yeah.
And that's not a use case that I often use. So that's a little bit of like me being blind to a specific use case that is not mine. And that's where the user feedback comes in, because, you know, enough people asked me or made a remark about this, saying like, you know, it's not live. I expected it to be live, etc., etc., etc. So this release, I buckled down. I figured out like how can I have it be live and performant, and also in a way that it's not continuously updating, because the DOM in each viewport can be slightly different, and you don't want like 2 of them starting to fight. Like, no, I'm the current like tree. No, I'm the current tree, and so you have to build in some mechanisms there to make sure that that Polypane can decide, no, actually this is the one that I'm getting live feedback from now, and now it's this one, and now it's this one. And I've already built that for the scroll syncing in Polypane. So if you scroll in one pane, it scrolls in all the others. But of course, if you have a listener for that scrolling, you listen to a scroll event. And then you fire scroll events in all the other panes. Yeah. So if you then also listen to the scroll event in all those other panes, then it just...
You have an infinite loop.
You have an infinite loop. So you need to figure out some way of managing like who listens to what and when.
Yeah.
And I've built that for the live DOM view in the elements panel. in such a way that it doesn't significantly degrade performance, because it's also on the React side. Like, I'm building that DOM, it needs syntax highlighting, it has to collapse and expand, and DOM trees can be huge.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's what I've been working on for this release. And then
Goodness.
The head order is actually, it's quite simple. So there's
Wait. Sorry to interrupt you,
sure.
but before we get into the head order, you can't just talk about something like this live DOM view and change topics without getting deeper into the
Sure.
how. So again, my instinct here is to go with some type of conflict resilient data type, which is CRDT basically, because when I think about conditions where change A can overwrite change B, and maybe I don't want that, right? When I think of, I need some type of leader and follower architecture, or I need some type of authority figure, meaning which pane is the one that's sending the DOM at this point in time. That's where I go, CRDTs. Conflict resilient data types. Are those in play here? Or I guess the question more broadly is, how are you determining the leader and the followers?
Yeah, so I'm not using CRDTs. Because it can very well be that it doesn't make sense to stack changes from, for example, the mobile view, where you have some JavaScript that injects like a completely different menu, and your desktop view that just has like the header on the top and nothing fancy happening. And then it wouldn't make sense to stack diffs of those two on top of each other.
Right.
So I have a much more simpler like leader follower pattern, where the elements panel listens to the pane that you most recently interacted with.
Okay.
Until there is a certain timeout, and then if there is another pane that emits something, then that becomes the leader until a certain timeout, etc. So
this timeout is then determined by the almost replication leg, to mix terminology, between events in the dominant pane that you just interacted with and some follower pane.
Yeah.
Okay.
I
love this. Thank you for...
It's a little simpler than that, because like the alternative would be extremely complex.
Yeah, and potentially over-engineered.
Yes.
Great. This is so educational. I've been building on the web for over 20 years, but I love it when somebody's building something practically and you can come and explain it, not just to me, but to all the other listeners. I get it. And I think the real goal with this podcast is that listeners who are attentive can go, oh, that sounded really complex in the beginning. Indeed, it does. And it still is appreciable complexity, but you make it seem so simple that, okay, I feel empowered now to just be comfortable in such an environment. I think that's awesome. Okay, so the final question I had about this live DOM view is the performance implications, as you mentioned. Not so much causing infinite loops, because by this leader follower pattern, that's resolved. But I would hate an experience where on the dominant pane I scroll, I don't know, like 100, 200 pixels down, and the followers visibly lag. I want them all to scroll at exactly the same, even 100 or 300 milliseconds. What measures do you have in place to ensure that?
So the real trick there is
causing lag on the dominant one as well.
There are tools that do that. There are specific like scroll syncing implementations that specifically wait for a pingback from the WebSocket they create, and then they essentially take over scrolling. What's very important to me in Polypane, again, is that if you scroll, you need to get the native browser scrolling. Like you need to have inertia scrolling on Mac. You need to have whatever it is that Windows does when you scroll. It needs to be that thing. So I can't take over scrolling. It needs to be one-on-one. And that means that, yes, there is like initially a very slight delay of like tens of milliseconds for all the other panes to catch up. And from that point on, it's direct. And the trick there is something that you also discussed with Guillermo on your podcast, and it's, you need to do less. Like you need to do much. You need to do way less than you think you should if you're doing. Like, for example, I've rebuilt the scroll sync I think 3 or 4 times.
Wow.
And each time I end up with significantly less code. And, one way or the other, less code is always going to be faster.
Oh, that's such a great takeaway.
And it's all about, you start doing something and you think you need to keep track of a whole bunch of things. And then, if you do round 2, you realize that, actually, I don't need to keep track of all of these things. I can get away with, only syncing a single number, for example. And not caring about what happens after you sync. So there's no code validating. So it's really a process of refining that and figuring out like what's the least I have to do for this feature. And that's also how it works with the elements panel. But there is a bunch of inherent complexity there. And it all has to do with the parsing of the CSS. And there's all sorts of like very specific browser specification implementation stuff there that causes all of that if you want, we can get into. But I'm not sure if that's too interesting.
Yeah, I think I also identify another point of complexity where you're dynamically loading client content that has different heights across viewports. Meaning, because you have narrower space on mobile, right? Like the scroll height of the page increases a lot more. And then synchronizing scroll position despite this must be so complex. I think we're good. I understand the complexities of this live DOM view in terms of leader-follower architecture, in terms of performance. Let's talk about head order visualization and how that presents value to developers. And then after we're done with that, I do want to talk as well about some productivity and workflow style stuff, because you've said multiple times, in light of this user feedback, I sat down and figured it out. I want to talk about how one does that. But let's start with head order visualization. Yeah,
so that's actually, it's quite a bit simpler. In Polypane, I have a bunch of panels that give you like different insights into your web page structure. So there's an outline panel that shows you like the heading structure, and then it tells you if you skip headings or if there's anything else going on there that's not optimal. And one of those panels is called the meta panel. And the meta panel is where I show all the meta information. So all the stuff that isn't visual on the page. So that's things like all your open graph tags, all your preload links, your page language, if you set theme color, if you have a robots.txt or a websecurity.txt, or if you have some OEmbed data or JSON LD, or all the stuff
favicon or content security policy.
Exactly. And then so I think people use that panel for quite a lot is that I then take those elements and I create like pixel perfect social media previews. So for let me see if I can get all of them. Twitter, Slack, Facebook, Discord, Telegram, Google, Mastodon, and Blue Sky.
Okay.
I forgot one. LinkedIn.
It blows my mind that Open Graph is supposedly a standard, but it's not, because you just mentioned so many different. Do we know why that is?
Well, I think part of it is that everyone wants to do their own little thing, and like all of them have think something is more important than something else.
Right.
So, for example, between Facebook and LinkedIn has a much more stricter adherence to the Open Graph spec than Facebook, because Facebook will happily take your Twitter data and expose that instead. Whereas LinkedIn is like, no, this doesn't have an OG title, so it has no title.
Wow.
And so I've been like reverse engineering that for all these platforms. And then also, having to update that as the platforms update their things. But yeah, it's one of those things where they all just do whatever.
Yeah.
And they all get their data in slightly different ways, and sometimes they have some nice fallbacks, sometimes they don't have any fallbacks, sometimes they change their fallbacks. So it's been fun keeping up with that.
Yeah.
But
I'm
going back to the head order, like
yeah.
all the tags in your HTML head, like the content type, the title, your preloads, your scripts, your CSS style sheets, links, etc. There's an ideal order to them, and the ideal order being the one that causes the least amount of delays or waiting on other scripts to load, with like deferred and async, and having, for example, the content type all the way up front, because then browsers don't have to restart parsing. Or if they have to restart parsing, they do it as quickly as possible.
Wow.
And there's a script called capo that essentially does this for you. But it dumps it in your console. So you can run it and it dumps it in your console. So in Polypane, I've now built a visualization for that where you essentially get two bars, like one with your current head order and one with the ideal head order. And if you only see one, good job, because then your current head order is already the ideal order. But so far, I haven't seen that like in the wild. And then you can see like where is each DOM element currently in the order and where should it be. Like it draws an arrow between them to show you, like, you know, this thing should actually be here, this thing should be here. And that way you can like very quickly, if your dev framework allows that, like reorder them and see how that updates, and make sure that, you know, you're not accidentally introducing loading delays through the scripts you load or the style sheets you load, because they are blocking. Yeah. So you want to order them in such a way that they're not blocking the page itself, but they're only blocking the things that depend on them. So that's going to be super useful because it's really hard to figure that out like any other way.
And this feature is available in, like, if I go on polypane.app right now and download it, I should be able to use it.
So this is in the version that's currently blocked.
Oh, come on. The reason I'm asking is because for the life of me, no one has shown me why. By no one, I don't mean a person. I mean no tool, no editor, no like meta OG tag validator. Nothing in the world has shown me why. If I share my website, tej.as on X, the OG image just looks bad. I have no idea why. And it's perplexed me for months, where it's supposed to be a beautiful, like 1200 by 630, wide card. But in Twitter, it's like a square and beside it, the title and description. It's just a completely different. I have no idea why. My image is correctly sized. It's small. It's correctly compressed. I still don't know. And there's plenty of OG image debuggers all around. And they all say it should look like this. And indeed, it looks right on Signal, WhatsApp, on every platform except Twitter. And I don't know, nothing has shown me what the cause of this is. I'm hoping Polypane does, but now you tell me the version's blocked.
So what I've seen for that specifically is one of the other tricky things that Twitter does, and that Twitter does it specifically, but Slack doesn't, and Discord doesn't, and LinkedIn also doesn't, is that Twitter will do like a fast preview, and then periodically they check if things have changed, and then update like all their previews. So you can have like, if you share a link on Twitter and it has an OG image, and then a month later you replace that OG image, eventually Twitter will show you the new OG image, because it refetches that data. And what I've seen, and I haven't built this into Polypane because it has to do with time. and changes over time just aren't a thing that you can like easily visualize. But what I've seen Twitter do is when you share an URL initially, it will default to that summary style, which is the small square image and the text beside it. And then at some point, like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour later, it reparses that URL and then it changes it to the summary large image style.
Interesting.
So like the first thing to check is, are you using the summary large image style?
Yeah.
Then probably it could be that. The other thing is, what it could be is if you have multiple images, like multiple options, maybe it's using the wrong one. Another one is, do you use the image width and image height meta tags?
Interesting.
So for Twitter,
don't, I mean,
okay, so maybe you can try that. So for Twitter, you can also set meta tags that specify the width and the height of the image that you serve. And if you don't set them,
and this is
Twitter
sorry to interrupt you, but is this like meta name OG image height, or what's the how do you specify those?
So Twitter uses property and not name, which is it doesn't matter because Facebook Open Graph uses name, but it will happily use property if that's the attribute you use. And then Twitter uses property, but it will happily use name if that's the property you use. So even the spec doesn't really matter. Except if you post on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is like, no. We agreed on this. But yeah, so you can do like property is Twitter : image : height. And then give it the pixel value, and maybe that helps show the initial or the image in the initial size. You can try that.
Okay. I will definitely Twitter : image : height. How in the world? I didn't know this existed. I'm sure this is documented somewhere, and this sounds like your full-time job to just go like scour the web for all this. My goodness. Well, thank you for that. I got some consulting on this podcast. Feel free to invoice me after, because hopefully this fixes the website.
I hope so too.
Okay. Yeah, this head order thing is really cool. Especially, I'm thinking about the meta panel. Incredible. I think that's such a valuable feature. Speaking of value, I want to talk a little bit about the business side of Polypane. It is a business. You're the founder, CEO. You run it. I want to go on record and say I think the pricing model is actually great. By that I mean you have to pay for it after I think it's a week or a 2-week free trial.
Yeah.
That's so great because I think it was Cassidy Williams, Cassidy, who posted recently this app she made that automates filling out tax forms in the US because it's all the same form. You just have to like change a few values. And this app was a desktop app. And Cassidy mentioned she feels uncomfortable, but the only way you can get this app is if you buy it. Yeah. And she was like, this is so weird, but it's nice to make money for my work. Imagine that. Have you received pushback around like lacking a long-term free tier?
Yes,
because I feel like let's talk about that because we have this really great episode in production right now. It's not released, but it will be with the great Chad Whitaker, who's the head of open source at Sentry. Sentry gives away. This year they gave away $500,000 to open source, and they don't see it as a charity donation, but like no, we get value, so we pay for our meal. Yeah, there's no free lunch. Let's talk about the details here and the nuance around this, because I feel like developers, and if I'm not careful, myself included, we take free stuff for granted, and we go like, what do you mean this browser is not free? Chrome's free. Why is your thing not free? Yeah. I also know the greatest browser at this point in time, not for developers but for mass market consumers, in my opinion, is Arc by the browser company. And they're struggling to make money. I think they're very open about it. So let's talk about this as a business side. Let's talk about navigating the pushback and still having the strong will to be like, no, this is value and you pay for value.
Yeah. I mean, so the first thing you have to start with is that if you charge for a product, then there's just a portion of developers that are never going to buy it.
Yeah.
And like the hard thing there is not necessarily accepting that, but then also making sure that you don't let their opinions factor into your decisions. Because they'll always have like a very poor perception of you because you dare charging for something. And if you take that personally, it's not fun. And I'm getting better at that, but I'm also human. So that's not always easy. Typically nowadays I respond like a bit facetiously, because I say, I charge because I need to buy groceries, because if I don't buy groceries, I die. And that's kind of like it really flattens like the entire argument. Like, I'm working on this full time, and if I can't live off of this, then I can't work on it full time. Like it's literally one-on-one. That's how it works. And then usually like either they understand that or they don't. And then if they fall in the they don't camp, then they weren't going to be a potential customer anyway. And you need to let that go.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, something clicks there because, they also work to buy groceries to not die. Because we all do.
Yeah.
And that helps. And then from that point on, it's just like proving value.
Yeah.
Like I charge a specific amount. They need to get much more than that amount in value for it to be worth it. How do you go about proving that's the case? And again, like that's not going to be the case for everyone, because not everyone gets the same amount of value out of the things they use. And that's also fine. And sometimes that's useful feedback, and then sometimes it isn't. And that's what you do like with any other company, like testimonials, case studies. There's a free trial that they can use so they can experience it themselves. Then if they are convinced of the value, then there's the question of who pays. Like if you're a developer, a lot of developers don't realize that they can get their employer to pay for stuff, and that their employer is usually happy to pay for stuff. If that stuff is like, for example, with Polypane, it's $9 per month. If a random developer says like, yeah, I think this is going to save me like 15 minutes a month, then your employer is going to be like, why are we having this conversation? Just buy it.
Yeah.
Because this conversation is already more expensive than that tool. But, getting that awareness for developers, that's a lot of work. And then also, again, there's gradations there, because for some developers, it's not like that. For some developers, they need to go to the CTO, and the CTO then needs to check that, I'm not siphoning all their data or whatever. And it's this whole process. But for most developers, it can be that easy. And that means that rather than what a lot of people do, like developers are what they call in like the business speak, business to prosumer, B2P, in that they act like a consumer, but they buy something for business reasons. And that means that if you buy something as a consumer, you're going to compare it to other consumer goods. So feedback I often get is like, well, Polypane is more expensive than Spotify. I'm like, yeah, maybe. But that's not really a comparison that makes sense unless you only look at the dollar value.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it's worth noting you don't produce with Spotify usually, you just consume. Whereas with Polypane, you're using it to produce higher value stuff in theory.
Yeah, so it should make you more than it costs.
Yes. Yes. And Yeah, and indeed, I think if I was to use Polypane for my website, for example, this OG image issue stuff wouldn't exist. We talked with, again, I keep going back to this conversation with Chad, and just I feel tempted to almost publish your episode the same week as his because, and he has asked for a specific date because he's coordinating it with the launch of one of his initiatives, but
Nice.
The overlap is so significant here because both also care about developers but also fair compensation. And Chad mentions to make work like Polypane, which I don't know if it's open source. It's probably not because
It's not. No.
It's a yeah. But to make either way, to make the resulting work of a developer sustainable, open source or not. He mentions really 3 criteria. One, it has to be widely used, which Polypane is. 2, there has to be fair compensation, and we go into a lot of detail about what fair is. And you mentioned it maybe costs more than Spotify. I don't think it does actually. I think Spotify in Europe is the same.
Yeah.
And third, it has to be widely used, fairly compensated, and the third one is without the developer having to jump through hoops, which is all that is my long-winded way of asking. Do you sometimes feel like you have to jump through hoops just to be compensated for this valuable work? Is it just a straight line with hey, like you mentioned, some developers are just never going to pay for this, whatever. I'm going to go focus on the ones that are.
I mean, it's a process of discovery. And I'm still right in the middle of that, even though I've been doing this for 5 years now. It's always, you're constantly iterating on everything you iterate on as a business. So like the messaging, the checkout flow, the pricing structure, all the things, and you do that based partially on feedback, partially on like gut feel, and partially also on like what type of company do I want to be. Like for example, I give Polypane away to students through the GitHub Student Developer Pack, and that takes a lot of time because students aren't the most experienced, patient, or I forgot the English word. Like the most detail focused. So, for example, if they have an email address linked to their GitHub, but their email address has a typo, GitHub doesn't care. But Polypane uses that email to send license keys to. So if that email doesn't exist, they don't get a license key and they don't get to use Polypane. So that's something I have to fix. So that's something I have to fix nearly daily for us students somewhere in the world.
Wow.
And that's fine. I think that, or so I believe that making this available to students is the right call.
Yes.
Regardless of how much time that costs me. And of course, like in the ideal situation, all of these students go on to work at companies where they get their employees to buy them a commercial Polypane license. So that's like the end goal. But it's not the main goal. The main goal is that I think like all the tooling that Polypane provides in making websites more accessible, getting people acquainted with accessibility to begin with, like this is actually something you need to care about. And this is also something that you can be empowered in to care about. I think that's very important. And I think like the sooner that happens, the better for everyone on the web, because I have all my 10 fingers. I have good sight. I have no impairments that I'm aware of. But if a website is built accessibly, it's also better for me because an accessible website behaves in the way that I expect a website to behave. So everyone's better off. And then in exchange for that, it means that I do have to charge other people because I need to make a living, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. So this is Founder CEO series. There's a lot, believe me, a lot of overlap that I hear from what you're saying and what other people say. And sure, part of it, there's maybe a confounder here with you. You listen to the podcast and you maybe have heard other. I get it, but Brandon Bayer, and this is why I'm explicitly referencing unpublished episodes at the time of recording. Brandon Bayer and Glauber Costa, CEOs of Flight Control and Terzo Database, respectively, mentioned the hardest thing with building a developer-oriented product is getting the messaging and positioning correct.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Terzo is this globally edge-replicated SQLite database. The complexity there is sort of unimaginable for the vast majority of us mere mortals. And Flight Control, similar. So
Yeah.
it's this wrapper on AWS that really is heavily focused on great user experience, right? And so the engineering challenges are pretty complex. Despite that, these folks say the single hardest thing is not anything engineering related, but is messaging and positioning.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? Has that been your experience with Polypane as well?
Yes, because like you can, if there's an engineering problem, you can just keep hacking away on it until it works.
Yeah.
But for any given person, you only get one chance to get the messaging right. And of course, there's a lot of people, so you can still iterate on that, but you can never get like the feedback from that initial person on like subsequent versions or subsequent messaging. Whereas if you're working on a programming issue, you can just iterate until the cows come home. So I think that's part of it. But also computers deal in absolutes, so something works or it doesn't. Whereas with communication, which is soft and squishy, like it might work a little, but there might be something else that works much better. But to get there, you need to get over like the local maximum and then all this stuff. And there's nothing binary there where you can say like, yes, this is how it works. You can only sort of approach it and then think, this is heading in the right direction. For example, with Polypane, I used to be just like the browser for responsive design, which even when it launched, people were like, no, that's like, it does that, but it's like, that's just a little tiny bit that you see. So then I switched to the browser for ambitious developers, which is one I still really like because it also sets the stage for the people using the app. And it's no longer focused on what the app does, but who the app is for. So I still really like that one. But then a while ago, someone somewhere that I don't know mentioned Polypane, and they described it as it's like DevTools with cheats enabled. And I was like, that is what I'm trying to achieve. Like, it's like you're using a browser, you're using your DevTools, which is a thing every front-end developer or every design engineer knows.
Yeah.
But it's so much better that it feels like cheating. So I'm going with that now. But I'm already at a point where I'm like, okay, but maybe there's another way that's even better to initially describe what Polypane is, what Polypane does. So I'm, always
constantly
iterating.
trying to. Okay. That's the third person who says, this stuff is way harder. And that really makes, a lot of people are doing like DevRel as a service these days. I think that makes a case for the existence of their business. I've been asking this of everybody so far. I asked it of Guillermo Rausch, I asked it of David Khurshid, like a bunch of folks. And this really came out of a conversation I had over this last holiday season with some founders and CEOs, where we identified, there's living standards like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. These are specifications.
Yeah.
They have, when you encounter the keyword div, this element has these attributes, and it's very specific, and it evolves over time. I was thinking, and we were thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if there was such a document, a living standard for founders, technical founders and technical CEOs, where it's just full of things you can expect as you go into your venture. And there's no doubt there are playbooks and things at Y Combinator, for example, but I've yet to hear of, okay, these are salient commonalities in everyone's experience. And it would help set expectations for people embarking on the venture, but also for employees and teammates.
Yeah.
Because, in teams, a lot of people go like, oh my gosh, this person's texting me on Slack on Saturday. Wow, that's so bad. Is it bad? Who knows? Nobody says it's bad. There's no document.
Yeah.
Similarly, things about like working on vacation, or people do things like that as founders because you love your product. So I'm curious, with all of that said, if there was to exist such a living standard, such a document, what would you feel has to really go in there? If another way of framing it maybe is if a friend of yours wants to start a software product, what would you tell him or her to expect?
Okay, so this is actually an interesting question because if you look at the DevTools space, whenever people say like DevTools startups, usually they are talking about like some sort of hosting, like the hosting in like the literal sense, or database hosting, or like user management hosting, or some sort of online, for lack of a better word, portal where developers do stuff. And maybe there's some SDK involved, like for example Sentry, but like the meat of the dev tool is in a browser on a web page somewhere where you get info.
Yes.
And that means that things like the ideal sign-up flow, etc., they are very crystallized. Like the ideal sign-up flow for a dev tool is probably like sign up with GitHub and you're in. But none of that applies one-to-one to a tool that you have to download and install on your device. So there's always, like, whenever I'm researching this stuff, there's always like a mismatch where, like, yeah, I can see how this is like the way to do things, but it's also the way to do things that doesn't quite work for my situation. So that's where I don't think there's like one ideal way of approaching such a living standard or such a guidebook for technical founders. What I've noticed is that there's two types of features that you need to care about as a founder. The one is the easiest, and for some people maybe the hardest. It's listen to all your customers, talk to all your customers all the time, and from that synthesize what they need. And sometimes they will tell you directly, and sometimes they will be very specific in what they need because they're developers. And it's your job to then figure out that it's not actually that very specific thing that they're asking for that you need to build, but you need to build the other thing that also enables what they actually want. So that's your skill as a founder that interacts with your user base. And I think like the more you do it, the better you become at it, because that is something that you have a feedback loop in. Because as you release features, you get feedback on the features that were influenced by the same users that now give you feedback again. So that's one part. But the other part is features that no one asks for that everyone wants to use. So for example, Portal, the proxy, no one asked for that. They asked for, hey, can you build Polypane with WebKit? Like, I can't because it doesn't run on Linux. It doesn't run on Windows the same way you would there's reasons for that. So there's stuff no one asks for that can be a game changer when they actually use it. And that's your founder instinct. That's like what sets you apart from any other person building the same type of tools. And that's that's really hard because you can be super wrong. But that's also where you need to have like enough conviction to go like, yeah, I know no one is asking for this, but I think it's important. And if it takes me 2 weeks, 3 weeks to build, then, and I can't do anything else in those 3 weeks, like I can't deliver the value that people actually ask for, then that's the right trade-off, because this feature needs to exist.
Yeah.
So
fundamentally, as a founder, you're just making bets.
Yeah.
Right? You're making bets on yourself.
Yeah.
And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. I appreciate that. I think that's, for example, I think a great example of this is even Apple. When they decide, nobody wanted to get rid of the headphone jack, for example. And in fact, people criticized it. But they did want lighter, smaller devices. And the only way you do that is you get rid of the headphone jack. And turns out now nobody cares. And like, look at me. I've got wireless headphones on. And I think that there's definite value there. And in fact, I think what you mentioned, if I can extrapolate a little bit, is also being comfortable with betting on yourself and being comfortable with the eventual pushback that will come. Sort of even being prepared. Like, people are going to hate this initially, but then they're going to love it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, or they're not going to understand why this is important or why they should care. So, yeah, I mean, you got to have all the other things in place. So for DevTools, I think having docs is super important, and having very extensive docs and very detailed docs and docs containing details that no one really cares about, but that you care about, is important. And that goes to support like the features that you think need to exist. But on the other hand, like, there's very few companies that can get away with no docs, even if they're not developer focused.
Yeah. Good. I think that makes a lot of sense. I like that you call it a skill, like listening and engaging with your users is a skill, because as framed as a skill, that means we probably are not good at it. There's probably skill issues in the beginning, but walking as a skill, talking as a skill, being on a podcast, all skills can grow. I was never the best communicator, and it's just a skill that hopefully has grown in some capacity.
I can give an interesting example for that. Because as you launch something, you get bombarded with features, feature requests. And some of them are great, and some of them are a really bad idea. But if you're just starting out, you don't want to go and tell like your paying customers that their idea is dumb, right? That's just like, you can package it up and say it nicely, etc. But it's something that, you feel like, I don't want to tell these people that this is not the right call. Because it feels uncomfortable, because you're like dismissing their feedback, and it's very hard to get feedback as a founder. So you never want to discourage that, because it's difficult enough as it is. So that feels very uncomfortable. But as you work through that, and as you start to understand your user base, you can actually take them along and help them understand why something is a good or bad idea. For example, I get a lot of requests for device frames or browser UI around the panes in Polypane. So the panes in Polypane are just rectangles, but like this rectangle is an iPhone, and you have to imagine like the iPhone around it. And the reason I don't have the iPhone around it is because I'm not yet at a point, or Chromium is not yet at a point, where they can accurately emulate the way an iPhone responds, for example, when you scroll it. Because when you scroll it, a part of the viewport changes, like the address bar scrolls down, but that's implemented in a very specific way, where like your web page doesn't suddenly start to shift because it's now higher. Like, they do something clever, because they're Apple, to make sure that it feels really good. And I just can't emulate that right. I can fake it. No problem, because I have the prototype ready. I can ship it like in the next release. But it doesn't work the way it works on a phone, because I'm lacking specific APIs that just don't exist yet. So if I were to ship it in this state, and I can this is like I bring receipts when people ask me this. I'm like, okay, this is the Chromium ticket that I want to implement. This is why. This is how it actually should behave, and this is what I can do now, and that's bad because of this and this and this reason. And to the man, I get a response like, yeah, you've obviously thought of this way more than I have, and what you said is the right call. And I'm happy to wait for this to exist because I know that even though I want this feature now, I actually want that feature in the situation that you described.
Yeah.
And that means that I've now like scaled up to the point where I can say to people like, well, actually your idea won't work because, and not feel like I'm diminishing them, and also make them understand that that's not what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that skill is so important because, like you said, it's hard in the beginning because you're scared you'll alienate them fundamentally. And as a founder, you want people to know your product and use it and give it a fair try. And then if they don't like it, it's fine. But a lot of us we operate based off of initial impressions. Oh, he said no to me. He's a jerk. I'm not going to use his product. There's a lot of people right now who just are super angry with, for example, Vercel because they patch, fetch, and make opinions facts for developers. And I can't imagine the pain Guillermo and others may be feeling because of that. Because like it's I don't think that's the intent, right? And so what I'm hearing from you is the skill that you've cultivated that you think is important for other founders is to not have it be a situation where you're talking at the user, but you're talking with the user.
Exactly,
like you're like, hey, we made this decision as a way of serving you because we have this like big bird's eye view and we really think this is the best way. Here's the reasons why. And I love that you call attention to, and I bring receipts. And I wonder if just out of recency, this isn't the zeitgeist. People absolutely hate Vercel for doing whatever they do, like patching fetch or whatever it may be. I wonder if a blog post about here's why we're patching fetch, here's why it was the wrong call, this may help that taking the users with them. As a case study. That is so great. I think that's something that everybody needs to hear, not just founders. To be honest with you, I think even engineers and software teams, like employees, individual contributors, and engineering managers. I've had a hard time in previous roles where I've submitted feedback for something as part of DevRel, and the product team says, hey, you're submitting this in the wrong place, and it's met with some type of interpersonal resistance, which I've developed enough skills to navigate that well. But I think we give ourselves less credit than we deserve for being able to communicate non-verbally and receive non-verbal communication. And I think we can really infer when somebody rejects our idea because they reject us, or when they reject our idea because they reject the idea.
Exactly.
And I think that skill, is very, very important. Well, listen, Kilian, let's leave it here. We have so much more to cover. In fact, we should maybe do a follow-up at some point. It's been an absolute pleasure. You brought so much. I mean, you explained to us the difference between a rendering engine and a browser, how there's this distinction between the UI, the engine, and so on. We've talked at length about Polypane, about the value it adds even through live DOM view, leader-follower patterns, and running a business. On behalf of myself and all the listeners, I want to thank you so much for making the time to do this.
My pleasure.
And I hope,
to be here.
Absolutely, and I hope we can support Polypane in any way. In fact, let's do this. Whoever, if you listen to this episode and share it on social media, we'll give away a free Polypane license to a random share. We'll do that for sure. At least one.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kilian.
Thank you as well.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Kilian Valkhof. And now the question: how could your website or web app improve, and should you use Polypane? I'll leave that decision up to you. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then a great way to support it at no cost to you is to subscribe to the channel on YouTube, like it, and even share it on social media. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, then if you leave up to a 5-star review, that'd be a great way to support the podcast and make sure it continues. I'd love to continue, and I'd love to create things for you. If you leave a comment on either X or on YouTube with guests you'd like me to feature, topics you'd like me to cover, I would do that because ultimately this podcast is for you. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thanks for being a part of the podcast. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in engineering.